Hey, friends out there in Sega land. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of a problem with my camera. I changed my monitor orientation. Question is, uh, if you took those of you who remember the old Sega 32X add-on, the $160 attachment that you bolted onto your Sega Genesis and Sega CD, what would happen if you just unplugged the Genesis? That's the question I'm asking today in console history. Why Sega nearly went out of business and certainly went out of the console business. A lot of it is due to the fact that the Sega 32X and Sega CD were not well supported, especially the 32X. Unfortunately, it was only on the market. Wasn't released until November of 1994, thereby preventing the SVP lock-on cartridge from being released, even though Sega had already spent a lot of money developing that, and 4 games, by the way. And also destroyed confidence in the company and probably contributed to the failure of the Saturn outside of Japan. Japan being apparently the only country where the Saturn was successful because so few people had the Mega Drive that even fewer people had any thought of buying the 32X. Big time Sega enthusiasts ran out and spent $160. $160 altogether on the 32X. A lot of developers got involved. I believe about 32 games were released, 40 games were canceled, more games were canceled than were actually made. And the add-on ended up being one of the famous disasters that in video game console history, and Sega went from 55% market share, at least in the 16-bit market, to suddenly dropping. Tom Kalinske left because he no longer had any control over decision making, and a lot of other people, a lot of top talent left, a lot of top management left, and Sega quickly went down to 3% market share. The Saturn effectively sat dead on store shelves by 1998. They only released a couple more games for it, and by 1999, Sega was down to 0% market share. So it's kind of a very quick disaster, and bringing out the Dreamcast, which is a wonderful system that, in my opinion, was poorly marketed because they didn't show much of the games themselves. They had some other cultural marketing, which is becoming common at that time. But that system failed, and also the PlayStation 2 kind of put the last nail in the coffin. Question though, Kalinske and many of his, Tom Kalinske, if you don't know, brought Sega back. He was hired on, I think, in 1989 or 90. Brought in Sonic the Hedgehog as the mascot. He wanted to have go from cartridges to CD-ROM based system. In other words, today almost everything is CD, DVD, everything from the PlayStation on, other than maybe the Nintendo 64, CD, DVD, or Blu-ray. Nowadays we have fast digital downloads, but back in the day, some households didn't even have a modem, let alone gigabit connections like we have today. So games were really limited in size. Many of them at that time were only 1 or 2 megabytes, and many games still on the shelves were less than 1 megabyte. I had a few games that were 128 kilobytes, if you can believe that, smaller than a single floppy disk. However, what would be the cost and how much earlier could the system have been brought out? It would have been less than $200, still just like the 32X. Could have reused the same Genesis console, Genesis controllers, power adapter connections, what have you. So people already had a Genesis could just do a quick swap the box and get a CD-ROM based system. To keep costs down in those days, a 2-time CD-ROM would have added, I think, $50 to the cost of the Nintendo 64, which is why Nintendo ended up not using cartridges, or not using CD-ROMs, but sticking with cartridges, but also because they realized, I think, late in the day that their 4 kilobyte texture cache was killing the texture performance, and their only way around The problems on that system was to go with a cartridge and store huge uncompressed textures on the Nintendo 64 cartridges. Question though is, if you had a CD-ROM, the less expensive audio quality laser like you had in the Sega CD, which would lead to slow load times. 1 megabyte of less expensive PC RAM. If you had one of the SH2 RISC processors instead of two of them, like you had in the Saturn and 32X. Remember, 80 to 90% of games never used the second processor at all, and the few games that we know of that use both processors, most of them only used it for the second processor for a few side tasks. It wasn't really known very well at the time. Programmers didn't know how to write code for two processors, how to split threads. They weren't multi-threaded systems. They had no memory management units at all. They were very simple embedded systems. But the 32X had its own CPU. If it had less expensive PC RAM, which wasn't as fast, but you have 1 megabyte of it and store a whole stage in RAM without having to access the CD-ROM. The audio chip was more than sufficient, and the VDP that was already in the 32X was capable of 320 by 240, which was higher resolution even than the Sega Genesis, which was higher resolution than any of its competitors at that time, higher than the PlayStation, higher than the Super NES for actual games. Capable of drawing 256 out of 32,000 colors. And the 32X didn't really need the Genesis or Sega CD attached to it. It could function just fine in theory as a standalone. And some people would unplug the Genesis maybe by accident, and the 32X would continue displaying the image on screen, even though it would lose the signal from the Genesis, which was just drawing, the background image, and maybe drawing how many points you had in your life bar on one side and how many lives you had maybe on the bottom. The Genesis wasn't doing very much. And the truth is, even though at that time Sega had sold 30 million of them around the world and was quite successful in America, most people still didn't have a Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. Some people still had an old 8-bit system or they didn't have any game consoles at all. So to limit your market only to people who are Sega fans, and then especially to only target your market even more narrowly to game enthusiasts and people really excited about 3D graphics and 32-bit graphics. And then on top of that, to narrow it down to people who are almost certainly considering buying the Saturn, although the price hadn't been announced yet. The price wasn't announced formally until May of 1995. So the 32X add-on had been released in November of 1994. The Saturn wasn't supposed to come out for another year, so game developers had enough time to theoretically get games out for the system. Unfortunately, Sega of Japan overruled Kolinsky and insisted that they cancel everything else in October, killing the 32X and the Sega CD and everything that people had invested money into, and just finish the games that they had, canceling other games and switching them over to the Saturn. So everyone who made the mistake of buying the 32X, you lost everything. And so they were burned on Sega, and me being one of those people, I'd been a Sega fan since the Master System in 1987. We wouldn't buy Sega products anymore. Retailers had been burned. The Saturn turned out to be a $400 complex mess of a system that was really hard to develop good quality games for. The recent interview from Hideko Sato, a brilliant hardware engineer, lead hardware engineer for Sega of Japan, it turns out they had in fact built the Saturn originally as just a very basic sprite engine with the Hitachi SH1, later the SH2 RISC processor. And once they heard rumors from developers that the PlayStation was going to be able to draw 300,000 polygons per second. That turned out to be a lie. I don't believe any PlayStation 1 game ever drew more than 120,000, and most of the launch titles, because of the restrictive C libraries and the lack of knowledge of how the system worked, they were drawing 5 or 10,000, and a few did 20,000. I believe that some of the early limit pushers like Crash Bandicoot might have been doing 50 or 60,000 polygons. So the earlier lightweight Saturn actually would have been able to compete, ironically, with the PlayStation because the earlier Saturn was easier to program for. Once they started adding the DSP, another CPU, a second bank of lower cost, another megabyte of lower cost memory, the system management unit, system control unit, 3 different memory buses, an additional VDP for adding all sorts of other effects. It ironically ended up worsening the actual performance of Saturn games. They actually looked worse. And so ironically, the earlier lightweight, simpler Saturn would have cost less, probably would have hit the market at about $200 instead of $400. And on top of that, it was so hard to program for. Some developers in Japan and America would spend a week with the system. They couldn't draw anything to the screen. They had to manage VDP1 and VDP2, had 8 different processors, 7 of which were accessible to the programmer, and you had to balance and run all of these and maintain very careful control of this complex multi-bank memory system in order to display anything to the screen. And most developers couldn't do it, and a lot of developers just abandoned the Saturn. Or Sega of America was trying to import games from Japan and translate them, and for various reasons they weren't able to do so. Over 1,000 games ended up being made for the Saturn in Japan, the one market where they were making any money, and over maybe just over 200 games were brought out to the international market and translated. And it was the remaining Japanese titles that were left behind, especially the RPGs, which had become absolutely, red hot on, flying off store shelves. And in Japan, the Saturn was beating the PlayStation for most of those years, and particularly in RPGs, arcade ports. Of course, Sega dominated the arcade market at that time, so they had that inside advantage. They absolutely beat Nintendo for a long time in the Japanese market, but they wouldn't bring those games over, and they wouldn't bring over that kind of marketing. So unfortunately for that reason and other reasons, the Saturn failed. But then the Saturn kind of also brought down the 32X. Question is, the 32X, if it were made smaller, more economical, as a standalone unit, the CPU could have run at full speed. Remember, the SH2s were 20 megahertz components. I believe that they had to be throttled down, even though those are the exact same chip as in the Saturn. They had to be throttled down to 23 megahertz in order to be compatible with the Genesis. They also had a lot of development problems that held up the 32X for a couple of months because there were so many different Genesis models and Sega CD models. The CDX, JVC had a Sega CD. There were so many combination units out there, and the Sega CD ended up itself essentially being abandoned by the market. It was selling in some places for $99 in 1995, and in most stores it wasn't even available because no one was buying it, and no one was buying it because no new good games were coming out. Out of over 200 games for the Sega CD, there might have been 30 that were any good, and most people were getting burned on really low quality remakes of the same game. You were having to pay $70 for almost the exact same game with just slightly better sound, or much better sound in the case of Golden Axe and some of my favorite games, but it ended up not being worth it. I had the Sega CD, and I bought very, very few games for it. So Sega also abandoned that piece of hardware, and people got used to the company having a reputation for no longer supporting their old consoles and their old hardware. If you don't think that that matters, remember that the Sega Master System released in American shores in, I believe, 1987. Even after sales had tanked and the Genesis was out and well established, they continued support until 1992 and continued bringing out Sega Master System games until 1994. So people continued buying the Genesis because the Master System was still being supported, even though the sales were awful for the console. However, when Sega reversed itself and started abandoning all of its hardware, people weren't willing to take a risk, spend $400 on those, on the Saturn, and they weren't willing to spend any more money on any more Sega add-ons. Biggest problem, in my opinion, was that the roadmap was uncertain and people aren't willing to take a chance and spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on new hardware. Whereas when Sony came out with a PlayStation, yeah, they actually had fewer games on the market at first, and some of the PlayStation launch titles, frankly, were god awful. I'm not going to name names, but you've probably played some of them. Really wasn't until 1996 and 97 that really good PlayStation games started coming out. 1995 were not, might have been one or two that were actually worth playing. As a standalone console, the 32X CD could have come out much sooner, could have been released as early as spring of 1994 or possibly even Christmas of 1993 for the busy Christmas shopping season. I know that the Genesis was still selling very well, but for $150 or $200 to get a CD-based 32-bit RISC system that's capable of drawing, I believe, 20,000 textured polygons per second, or about 90,000 flat shaded polygons per second. So if you played Virtua Racer on the Genesis, that was usually drawing about 6,000 polygons per second on the system with the SVP chip. So the SVP wasn't being pushed at all. 90,000 polygons, flat shaded polygons per second, which a standalone console would be capable of. It's about the same as Virtua Racing for the arcade. So Virtua Racing, Virtua Fighter, Virtua Cop, the rest of the Virtua series, the early games would have been near perfect ports on a 32X CD standalone console. Daytona USA, I'm not sure that game would have looked anywhere near as good, although I'm sure that it would have played fine, being made up of flat shaded polygons instead of textured polygons. But we'll never know. But just state your opinion in the comments. Do you think, would you have considered purchasing a standalone console if you know that it would have had a couple of years on the market, 18 to 24 months, had a proper library of games, and been $150, $200 at the time, rather than the outrageously expensive add-on that we ended up with that was canceled about 8 or 9 months after it was released?